From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, my name is Terry Sierra. I'm the chief of the Serial and Government Publications Division that's sponsoring this program. And it is my great pleasure to introduce to you a real good friend of our division and of the library, Professor Joe Campbell. He has been here before. He's a regular coming to our reading room at least twice a year. We see him sauntering in, followed by a bunch of his students, and he's introducing these students to primary sources, namely newspapers. He's become an expert. If you guys need help out there with the scan view, microfilm readers, that's your guy. Anyway, seriously, he has a PhD from North Carolina, right? Am I right? Yes. He's a tenured professor at American University. He has written numerous books, articles. I've seen him on TV a number of times, where he makes appearances on a regular basis. I was talking to somebody this morning about one of the books he wrote that I found very intriguing. It's called 1995, The Watershed Year. Did I say that right mostly? Okay. And why is 1995 all that important? You might wonder. Well, Professor Campbell has an idea. That was the year of the Oklahoma City bombing. The trial of the century. The man is now free and in Florida. Monica Lewinsky, anybody remember that? And the launching of the internet. So he has something going on there. But I won't bore you with all my great interest in what he writes and how he approaches his teaching career. He has received many awards, and I think perhaps, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe he'll tell me someday, his greatest award and that he treasures the most is the year that he was named Faculty Member of the Year by the Student Body of American University. So it's a great honor. So why don't you help me bring him to the podium, give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Terry, thanks very much. That was a great introduction. Yeah, 1995. I think the subtitle was The Year the Future Began, but I kind of like yours a little better. It's the watershed year. And what did we say? The internet, Oklahoma City, the bombing there, the O.J. Simpson trial of the century. Clinton meets Lewinsky and begins the dalliance that led to his impeachment. And also the Dayton Peace Accords in 1995 that ended the long war in Bosnia. And it was really a moment in which the United States found itself at the peak of its post-war power. It was the unrivaled superpower and was able to bring an end to this long and bloody conflict in Bosnia. So, yes, those are the respective chapters of 1995, the year the future began. But that was a book that came out 2 years ago. And today, we're talking about, related to a book that came out, a second edition that came out just about a year ago, titled Getting It Wrong, Debunking the Greatest Myths in American Journalism. And it takes a look at media-driven myths, which are prominent stories about and or by the news media that are widely believed and often retold, but which under close inspection, under scrutiny, dissolve as apocryphal or wildly exaggerated. Media-driven myths. And they so happen to be fairly close cousins to fake news. You can think of media myths as prominent cases of fake news that have masqueraded as factual for many, many years. So that'll be the essence of the talk today. And I look forward to engaging you all with some questions and answers and comments during the Q&A section that'll follow. But first, let me say it's a terrific pleasure to be back at the Library of Congress. I have, as Terry was suggesting, done a lot of my research at the Library of Congress over the years. And what better way to do it than reading microfilm, squinting into the microfilm reader. And I can't say that I am up to speed on the view scans. I do get training every once in a while on that, and then I sort of completely forget about it, and I'm back on the old crank machines, which I love. And I've done a good deal of my research over the past 20 years here at the Library of Congress. So it's really a pleasure to be back, to be invited back, to give a talk, and to talk about some of my research. And not only do I do a lot of research here, but many of my students, I bring students to the Library of Congress. And over the years, I've been at American University now 20 years, and over those years, hundreds of my students, undergrad and grad students, have come to the Library of Congress, have come mostly to the newspaper and current periodical reading room to do research on research-related assignments in my classes. And they have, without exception, enjoyed the experience. For undergrads especially, it's kind of cool for them to say that they've been able to do research at the Library of Congress, this fantastic, only in Washington institution. And for students studying in DC, this is a must-do, to come to the Library of Congress, not to get the reader's card and take a tour, but to actually do research, to crank the microfilm. And here's a couple of students doing just that. So my thanks again to Terry and Georgia Higley and their colleagues for the invitation today. It is an opportunity to talk about some of my research and also to explore with you some of the recent developments in what is known as fake news. Fake news. Now, believe it or not, there are people who think that fake news is not really all that big of a problem. And there was a fair amount of discussion earlier this year in journalism reviews and journalism periodicals about whether this is serious enough to really merit a lot of attention. And the thinking was, well, fake news is kind of ephemeral. It appears on these, way out there websites, and it's really not getting all that many eyeballs compared to mainstream media outlets, both traditional and online. So there's this thinking that maybe we're overstating fake news, especially the effects of fake news, that maybe it's not as important or as decisive as some people try to make it out to be, that it really may not be such a problem after all. But then again, you might want to tell that to Comet Ping Pong, the pizzeria on Connecticut Avenue that had these episodes of fake news are so bizarre, but this one, as you probably remember, was the site of an encounter back in December in which a guy, 28-year-old from North Carolina, drove up to the restaurant and to investigate, as he said, to self-investigate reports that the pizzeria was being used by Hillary Clinton and her campaign manager to run a child sex ring in the back rooms and in the basement. I mean, it's just a bizarre story. It's not even close to being plausible, but nonetheless, it was out there in the netherworld of the internet. And this was an example of fake news that really went viral. And this episode in which a guy from North Carolina came up to self-investigate, and he discharged a firearm inside the restaurant, causing a complete shutdown of that restaurant as well as restaurants and businesses nearby. It was a serious, serious problem. And the story continues to circulate, even though it's been widely debunked, routinely rejected as implausible. But it exists, and it's out there, and it continues to circulate. So it is an example of fake news being a serious problem, or turning into a serious problem. And then just the other day, we were reminded of the reach of fake news. As this New York Times article reports, Google and Facebook feeds, news feeds on those two platforms, recipients were receiving word that the shooter at the Las Vegas casino was a liberal, was a fan of Rachel Maddow, not a fan of Donald Trump, supported by MoveOn.org, and that he had been linked to the Islamic State. All of which was untrue. None of this stuff is accurate, but it was out there and had been passed on through the algorithms of Facebook and Google to many, many unsuspecting recipients of these platforms. And Facebook has other problems, as you no doubt have been aware. I mean, it's not just a fake news problem, but fake ads have circulated on Facebook, including those linked to accounts linked to Russia over the past several months during the presidential campaign last year and into this year as well. So Facebook and Google in particular have problems in terms of letting algorithms drive their content, what appears on their platforms, on their news feeds. And this is no minor issue. This is no minor problem. And it's hard to see how Facebook and Google can let this go on by just allowing algorithms to drive content. And that's essentially where we are now. So anything, almost anything, wild stuff, phony ads can get up there and reach incredible numbers of people. Because these platforms, 2/3 of American adults every day tap into social media of one kind or another for news. So this is a serious issue in terms of undercutting popular discourse. One thing I will say about fake news, though, it's not new. We have dealt with fake news for many years. Perhaps not with the intensity that algorithms transmit news to news feeds of Facebook and Google, but nonetheless, it has been out there, it has circulated. For example, the New York Sun, in August of 1835, published a 6-part series in which it reported, this penny newspaper in New York City, reported that there was life found on the moon, and that the lunar landscape was populated by exotic animals as well as bat-wing humanoid characters. The New York Sun's ostensible source for this reporting was the work of an astronomer named John Herschel, who was reporting from the southern hemisphere that he had been able to see these objects on the lunar surface, even to the degree of being able to determine the gender of these winged humanoid figures. The New York Sun, 1835. Later in the 19th century, in 1897, a New York Herald reporter named George Bronson Rea published a book called Facts and Fakes About Cuba. Facts and Fakes About Cuba. And he was lamenting, this reporter, he was lamenting the circulation of fakes, fake news, about the Cuban insurrection that led in 1898 to the Spanish-American War. And he was complaining and laid out his case in a book that came out in early 1897 about the correspondents for New York newspapers as well as others who were out there peddling this garbage, this made-up stuff, these extreme stories about Spanish atrocities on Cuba, intended, he thought, to whip up public sentiment at home in the United States to support U.S. intervention in the war for Cuban independence. That's what happened, but not because of news content necessarily. It's because of other factors, a diplomatic clash between the United States, Cuba, and Spain, the colonial rulers, and that's what led in April of 1898, to the Spanish-American War. But the point here is that fakes and facts have been long disputed and have been long a subject in American journalism. Now, one problem with fake news in a contemporary context is, what do we mean by this? What do we mean? It's a term that's proven very flexible, very fluid. In fact, so fluid that the Washington Post's media writer, Margaret Sullivan, came out earlier this year and said, you know, this term ought to be banned because we can't make any sense out of it. It's been corrupted. It's been appropriated. Yeah, it's been appropriated by the President of the United States, who routinely invokes the term fake news to criticize and comment on anything that he doesn't think is entirely accurate, or at least does not put his administration and his policies in the best light. Fake news, he calls them. Now, Trump, of course, as we know, has been one of the purveyors of fake news for many months, if not years. He was a advocate of the birther interpretation of Barack Obama's birthplace. He was, he was also one of the, during the primary campaign last year in 2016, he accused Ted Cruz's father of being complicit in the JFK assassination. Something he picked up presumably from the National Enquirer or something akin to that. But Trump has been out there, even from the day he took office, he was saying, that crowd out there was the biggest crowd ever for an inauguration. More people saw my inauguration than anybody else's. Demonstrably not true. I mean, there are a lot of photographs that suggested that, there was a pretty thin turnout in the streets of Washington for Trump's inauguration. But nonetheless, it just is emblematic of his use of exaggeration, hyperbole, falsehood, to push an agenda, I suppose, his own agenda. He's very narcissistic. Anyway, he has made great use of false news or fake news and is one of the reasons why the Washington Post suggested we bury this term. But it's out there. And again, the definitions are very difficult to pin down. The online site Vox says that false news defines it this way. False news claims are presented in an official-looking way, often online, and in a way that's intended to deceive readers, intended to deceive. The Post has said it's defined fake news as deliberately constructed lies in the form of news articles that are meant to mislead the public. So you see, both of these definitions include a sense of intentionality. Now, I would offer a definition that sort of takes us away from intentionality and just embraces everything that is false, erroneous, dubious, media-driven tales that circulate widely and serve to corrupt or warp popular discourse. And as we can see from the examples I mentioned earlier, that's exactly what fake news does. It corrupts and warps popular discourse. Now, my definition has these advantages. It removes intent, which can be very difficult to prove. How do you know what's going on inside the mind of somebody who's intentionally or not putting out erroneous information? So we just get rid of intent. It also recognizes that there is this potential warping or corrupting effect of fake news. A serious problem in my view. And thirdly, this definition insists that this is not just a social media problem. This is not just a problem of the internet and its far out there fringes. This also includes mainstream media. It is far more than just fake news. It's far more than just postings at obscure websites on the fringes of the online world. In fact, the news media these days are widely distrusted for an ability to present news in a fair-minded and accurate fashion. And you can see from this chart, these are Gallup polls that go back 40 plus years. And what is shown here goes back about 20, showing how popular recognition of the trust in the media has subsided, has eased down, has ebbed consistently since the late 1990s, and has reached a low during the presidential campaign of 2016. Less than 1/3 of American adults responding to the survey found that the news media, they could have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in what the news media were reporting. So I submit that fake news includes and should include, a discussion of fake news should include mainstream news media as well. And the media do have a trust problem, as we can see. And there are a number of examples of mainstream media putting out stories that had to be retracted or walked back or modified. These are dubious tales that corrupt the popular discourse and would meet my definition of fake news. The first one there is from the Washington Post, in which the Post reported that a Russia-linked operation had hacked into the U.S. electrical grid through a utility in Vermont. Serious stuff. Serious stuff. If the Russians are tapping into the electrical grid, there's potential problems ahead. The story turned out to be considerably less than that. There was one laptop at a Vermont utility that had some malware that is like that used by some Russian hackers that may or may not have been connected to the grid. In fact, the Vermont utility said it hadn't been. So there's from this one case of malware on a laptop, the Post blew up this story to Russian intervention, Russian hacking into the U.S. electrical grid. That's kind of fake news. Another one that got wide attention right after Trump's inauguration was the Time magazine report that Trump or his aides had removed the bust of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. from the Oval Office. Time put this out there. It was a pool report, and the Time reporter was the pool reporter at that time. Reported it apparently without checking or asking or looking around, and had to retract it. But this story is often invoked by conservative critics of the news media as an example of the media getting it wrong, putting out fake news. And then, of course, there was the case this summer in which 3 top-level CNN staffers, including a Pulitzer Prize winner for the New York Times, had to resign because of a story linking Scaramucci, a Trump associate, and later, for 10 days, a Trump White House staffer, to a Russian investment house. A story that CNN put out there, posted online, on the basis of a single anonymous source, one anonymous source, and retracted the story and forced the 3 staffers to resign. The exact details of what went on in that case and why the story was totally erroneous or poorly reported has never really been disclosed. There's still questions about why they took the steps that they did. But nonetheless, this is an example of a story that was out there, supported by an investigative team at CNN, that later blew up in its face. And I'm thinking that maybe these examples are not all that surprising, because some of the best known stories that journalists tell about themselves and about their profession are themselves exaggerated, mythical. They're media myths. And among them is the tale of Watergate. Watergate. That the dogged reporting of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein for the Washington Post uncovered the evidence that forced Richard Nixon to resign the presidency. This is the dominant narrative of Watergate. You find this everywhere. It's in journalism textbooks. It's in the popular media. It's a shorthand version of what this scandal was all about. And it is derived from, in part, Woodward and Bernstein's very successful book that came out just months before Richard Nixon resigned in August of '74, based also on the very successful film that based on their book, same title, All the President's Men, that came out in 1976, and also based on the 20 or so year long guessing game, more like 30-year guessing game, about the identity of the super secret source that Woodward had, whom was identified only in the book and movie as Deep Throat. Turned out to be Mark Felt, the number 2 at the FBI, who is the subject of a movie now that's just out these days, called Mark Felt, the Man Who Took Down the White House. The reviews have been pretty terrible, but I still plan to see it. In any event, it's not as good, I guess, as All the President's Men, the movie version, the cinematic version of All the President's Men. It's interesting that even at the Post, the principals on the news side of the Post over the years have rejected this interpretation, this heroic journalist narrative of Watergate. They've scoffed at it. Katharine Graham, who was the publisher before, during, and after the Watergate period, said at the 25th anniversary of the break-in, the seminal crime of the Watergate scandal, a break-in of Democratic National Headquarters in June of 1972, she said at the 25th anniversary of this, sometimes people accuse us of bringing down a president, which, of course, we did not do. The processes that caused Richard Nixon's resignation were constitutional. And she's not alone. Ben Bradley, the executive editor of the Post at the time, shown here on your right, said about the same time that it must be remembered that Nixon got Nixon. It wasn't the Post that got Nixon. And he's referring here to the secret White House tapes that Richard Nixon made of most conversations in the Oval Office between 1971 and 73, tapes that captured him approving a plan to divert the investigation into the Watergate break-in. Clear obstruction of justice that led to his resignation in August of 1974. Nixon got Nixon. The Post didn't get Nixon, according to Ben Bradley. And Bob Woodward, in earthier terms, has said somewhat the same. To say that the press brought down Nixon, that's horse poop. I think that's what those are for. Anyway, he too has been adamant about this heroic journalist interpretation being a wrong-headed interpretation of Watergate. And I think the ombudsman for the Post back at the 10 or 12 years ago, a great guy by the name of Michael Gettler, and was ombudsman after that for PBS for a number of years. Gettler captured it correctly, that it was not the Post, but it was the FBI, a Congress acting in bipartisan fashion, and the courts that brought down the Richard Nixon administration. It wasn't the Post, and I think Gettler's quite right. Because to roll up a scandal of the dimensions of Watergate required the collective, if not always the coordinated efforts of many forces and factors, including special prosecutors, federal judges, both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, Justice Department, and FBI. And even then, with all these forces arrayed against Richard Nixon, he would have walked. He would have survived the Watergate scandal had it not been for those tapes, had it not been for the clear-cut evidence that showed Nixon was culpable of obstructing justice. It needed that kind of certain evidence to dynamite the president from the Oval Office. He resigned in August 74 before he could be impeached and convicted. He certainly would have been both. So why does this interpretation, this media myth of the heroic journalist, why does this live on? Why does this persist? Why is it the dominant narrative? At least three reasons. It's convenient shorthand for explaining the Watergate scandal nowadays. It's been 45 years since the burglary at the Democratic National Headquarters, and there's been a lot that happened during those 2.5 years of the Watergate period. Who was doing what and where, and who was Haldeman, who was Mitchell, who were all these guys? It's hard. It was hard to keep it straight at the time, and it's impossible to keep it straight these days. So what we have as the dominant narrative is a simplified, easily accessible shorthand that explains Watergate, that embraces the essence of the scandal, i.e. Richard Nixon resigned, but adds a little media-centric window dressing to it. That it was because of these dogged, intrepid reporters that Richard Nixon lost his office. It's easy to explain. It's convenient. It's simplistic. It avoids the complexities of what was a very sprawling and complex scandal. And it's also very reassuring to journalists. It lives on because it's a reassuring tale. It's an affirmation tale that journalists can make a difference, that they can be decisive forces and factors in the greater scheme of things in American politics. It's a media-centric interpretation, but it's also one that's reassuring to journalists. Let's move on to another, more recent, if you will, media myth, that of the coverage of Hurricane Katrina 12 years ago, 2005. The media themselves patted themselves on the back, saying this was a triumph, a media triumph. I call it the myth of superlative reporting. There was a lot of self-referential praise in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane's passage. It made landfall just east of New Orleans, and in the aftermath of the hurricane's passage, the dikes protecting the city were breached, flooding much of New Orleans. In the aftermath, the likes of Dan Rather were very extravagant in saying that this was a high, heroic moment in American journalism. He called it one of the quintessential great moments in television news, ranking right up there with the Nixon-Kennedy debates, the Kennedy assassination, the Watergate coverage, you name it. It was a landmark, Dan Rather said. And the media narrative about Hurricane Katrina was much like that this was a memorable moment in which the media found their voice and were able to confront and stand up to public officials, local, state, and federal, holding them accountable for what was a pretty muddled response, especially by federal and local authorities in New Orleans in the aftermath of the hurricane. The reality, though, was quite different. The reality of the reporting was quite different. There was no high heroic moment in American journalism, and in important respects, the coverage of Hurricane Katrina's aftermath was badly flawed and exaggerated. They got it wrong. On crucial details, journalists were in error. They described scenes of apocalyptic horror and mayhem and lawlessness that the storm supposedly had unleashed across New Orleans. They told of snipers firing at medical personnel, snipers firing at helicopters. They told of bodies being stacked up like cordwood in the Superdome and Convention Center where people sought refuge from the storm's after effects. They talked about roving gangs preying on tourists and terrorizing people who took refuge in the Superdome. They said children were the victims of sexual assault, how one 7-year-old was raped and had her throat slashed. They also spoke about other horrors, sharks plying the floodwaters of New Orleans, things like that. This was a U.S. and an international media response. The international media, particularly the British media, just loved this story about the apocalypse in New Orleans. This was a moment in which the United States was being brought down, and the British national media just ate it up. But so did the U.S. news media. The media narrative, the dominant media narrative, was of chaos, anarchy, mayhem. And few, if any, of these horrific accounts of lawlessness, anarchy, and the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina's passage were true. Some reporting was done afterwards and found that almost all of these stories, based largely on rumor, were exaggerated, untrue. The effects were to paint for America and the rest of the world scenes of unimaginable horror. And they had the effect of defaming a city and its people at a time of their greatest need. And these misreported stories about anarchy and chaos and mayhem in New Orleans also had the effect of slowing the arrival of federal aid and assistance to New Orleans. The deployment of aid was slowed down because the situation seemed so untenable that you could not put people in there until you were certain that everything was under control. These news reports in the first days after Hurricane Katrina's passage made it clear that the situation was not under control. In fact, it was one of mayhem and chaos. As they say, that was untrue. It was largely debunked. In fact, a bipartisan congressional committee looking into the response to Hurricane Katrina, touched on the media's coverage too. Came to the conclusion that if anyone rioted in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, it was the media. But as I say, chaos was the media narrative. And I believe we have some front pages on the display table there that suggest as much, including the one that is on your far right from the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans newspaper. Help us, please. The subheading read, "After the disaster, chaos and lawlessness ruled the streets." And that, as I say, was the dominant media narrative. So I think it's important to keep in mind that early accounts of disasters often are in error. Not always, but they often are. Hurricane Katrina was one of those cases. And it's also, I think, useful to keep in mind that mainstream media are not always going to get it right. They're not always going to get it right. So with that in mind, I'd like to offer a few practical, straightforward suggestions that may be useful in combating fake news from whatever the source. My first suggestion, there are 5 of them. My first suggestion was that one about the mainstream media. They can get it wrong in the early reporting about disasters. My second suggestion is develop an ability to take the sniff test. The sniff test, it's akin to when you open the refrigerator door and the milk has gone bad. You know it. And it's like that with news stories. If something just doesn't seem quite right, if it smells a little off, then maybe you should treat it as something that's maybe not quite accurate. Like the shooter in Las Vegas. I mean, those early reports that appeared on Facebook and Google, probably a little too exaggerated to be true, to pass the sniff test. Be wary of sources of stories that rely exclusively on anonymous sources. And one of my favorite examples of that is the Washington Post's report in early April 2003 about Jessica Lynch, a young 19-year-old waif-like Army supply clerk from West Virginia who signed up for the Army to be able to use the benefits later on to go to college and get a degree. She was in a supply unit. She was in a maintenance company, never expected to see combat in Iraq. But because of a wrong turn that her unit took in the early days of the Iraq War, right after the invasion began in March of 2003, Jessica Lynch's unit came under ambush in the city of Nasiriyah in southern Iraq. And the unit was badly shot up. 11 people were killed in the unit, and several were taken prisoner, among them Jessica Lynch. She was badly injured and was rescued by a special operations unit on the 1st of April 2003. It was the first time that an American prisoner of war had been rescued from behind enemy lines during combat operations. The first time since World War II. 2 days after the rescue, the Washington Post reports this story on the front page, that she was fighting to the death, based on 2 anonymous sources whom the Post has never identified. Jessica Lynch was reported to be fighting like a female Rambo, attacking Iraqis, firing her weapon until she ran out of ammunition. She kept the Iraqis at bay despite herself being shot and stabbed and seeing colleagues fall all around her. It was an electrifying story. It was a story that was picked up by news organizations around the world. It was a story that was irresistibly good in a lot of ways. It was based on 2 anonymous sources. Neither of the Post reporters whose byline appeared on that story were in Iraq at the time. They reported this story from Washington. The story turned out to be wrong in all important respects. Jessica Lynch was in Iraq. She was in Nasiriyah with her unit, She did not fire a shot during the ambush. Her gun jammed. And she was in the back seat of a Humvee as it tried to escape the ambush. And she, as the Humvee was trying to make its escape from the city, she was in the back seat with her head down between her knees saying, "Oh my God, please get us out of here. Oh my God, please get us out of here." The Humvee was struck by a rocket-propelled grenade and was thrown into the backside of a disabled tractor-trailer truck. And Jessica Lynch was seriously injured in that crash. She did not suffer gunshot or stab wounds, but she was badly injured in that crash. The Post never explained how it got it wrong, so badly wrong. It never discussed who its sources were. On one occasion, one of the reporters said in an NPR interview, "Our sources for that story were not the Pentagon. They were not military sources. We could never get anybody at the Pentagon to talk about Jessica Lynch," which left people wondering, okay, who could it have been? Who could it have been? Anonymous sources in Washington, and the town is just full of them. The point here is to be wary of stories based on anonymous sources. Here are a few more suggestions. Wait, I'm not done. Try to cultivate a little viewpoint diversity. Check your biases. I guess this is a recommendation that students hear a lot. Check your biases. You know, if you're used to reading the New York Times, why not pick up the Wall Street Journal's opinion page every once in a while, just to see what else is going on. Develop a taste for viewpoint diversity. And don't be fooled by satire either. Don't be fooled by satire. People are, and it's out there, and it's plausible, but it really would kind of fit into the fake news definition, I guess. And some of the best satire appears in the New Yorker. Andy Borowitz is great, and his satiric column appears periodically, and this is one example of Borowitz's satire. People get fooled by this. They think it's true because it's so good, and it's on the cusp of plausibility. On the cusp of plausibility. So let me just recap. Remember that early accounts of disasters often are untrue. There are errors there, and to be wary of those. Hone that ability to develop the sniff test. If stories don't seem to be quite right, you're probably right. Applying your logic, you're applying your experience. Say, maybe it's not quite true. The sniff test. Be wary of stories based exclusively or largely on anonymous sources. This is a real trap for journalists. They need to do more about this. This is a toxic equation in many times in which they rely on anonymous sources, and they do so cavalierly, in my view. Cultivate viewpoint diversity. And don't be fooled by satire in the media. And to close, another example from Borowitz. People believe this. This one went viral in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election. Again, just plausible enough. It's just believable enough to maybe it was true. Thank you, folks. Thank you very much for your attention.
We do have time for some questions.
Questions, comments? Yes, sir.
I would take issue with two things, I guess, that you said. I think in your definition of fake news, in not allowing for intent, then you don't acknowledge that news media do make mistakes. They've always made mistakes out of sometimes carelessness, sometimes bad sources, sometimes misinterpretation. But there's a corrective built in there that when they find out about their mistakes, they correct them, which malicious fake news doesn't. Second point,
I think on that one, let me just answer that one because it's so good. I would take issue with that. I don't think the news media are very good about making corrections on big mistakes. When they get somebody's age or address, hometown wrong, they'll quickly do that. But on a major story that they screw it up, the tendency is not to roll it back, not to retract it. The Jessica Lynch story, granted it's 12, 15 years old now, it's an example. They never explained, the Post never explained how it got it so badly wrong.
But other media corrected it.
Not exactly. We don't know exactly how the Post got it wrong. We know that she herself later said that she was no hero, although she also said, I could have taken credit and no one else would have known. A little bit of larceny in the heart there, but nonetheless, she never did say I was a hero. She never acknowledged hero status, to her credit. So anyway, I would argue that news organizations really hate to roll back major stories that are wrong, and we can think of other examples, perhaps more recent. The Hurricane Katrina case is a more recent example. There was like a one-off look back by many news organizations, the New York Times, the Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Times of London, sort of took a look back to see, okay, and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, to its credit as well, took a look back and say, okay, how did we get this story so wrong? The story of mayhem and violence and Mad Max-like mayhem in New Orleans. And they did a one-off shot about that. But it wasn't really a retraction. It was just sort of saying a lot of news reports were based on rumor that were out of hand, and that was it. It was a one-off. So, yeah, I'm a little reluctant to embrace that notion that there is this corrective mechanism that news organizations really like to embrace. And your second question was?
I think in giving short shrift to Woodward and Bernstein's role in Watergate, that you don't acknowledge the role that the media did play in revealing the depth of the corruption of the Nixon administration. If the media hadn't kept the heat on in the summer of '72, in the fall, and so on, we wouldn't have had congressional committees, we wouldn't have had deeper investigation. So I think you leave the wrong impression there when you say, well, the Post didn't bring down the president, but the Post and other papers and organizations laid the groundwork for that.
Maybe. I think you're right. There were other organizations reporting this story, the early days of Watergate, but the news organizations were clearly behind the Justice Department's investigation, the FBI's investigation. They never learned anything from the news media that they didn't uncover themselves. This is not to tout the FBI or the Justice Department, but they had a pretty good understanding of the scope of the scandal well before the news media, and sources for the Post as well as other news organizations were the FBI and the like. So. Sam Erwin, who was the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Watergate, which held hearings in the spring and summer of 1973, identified a number of forces and factors, including the news media, but many others as well, who helped prepare the ground for the hearings of that summer. So I would argue, and do argue in my book, that it's a marginal role that the news media had in uncovering and keeping the heat on during the Watergate scandal. Even if we accept that the news media were good in keeping the attention level up there, it's a far cry from saying that the news media brought down Richard Nixon. It's quite a different interpretation. Finally, on that point, Woodward and Bernstein themselves have said in their book that they were kind of like out of ammunition on Watergate by the end of October of 1972. And they were talking about writing their book and so forth, All the President's Men, which they did late in that year and early in 1973. So they too were sort of at bay by the end of October in '72. Yes, ma'am.
Would you speak to the incentive that there is in getting the biggest headline the fastest? Because we have a case in point right now with Trump in Puerto Rico saying that, well, at least this is not the catastrophe that Katrina was. And I think that he's referring to the narrative of those initial reports.
He may have been. Look, it's the president is going to command. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I knew I was going to forget to ask myself to repeat the question, which was related to the biggest headline and Trump's visit to Puerto Rico and linking the hurricane damage there to Hurricane Katrina. Did I do justice to your question, or is that just totally butchered?
Well, I think that one as an illustration of why this is one that we have a recent case.
Okay.
It's lasted for years.
Sure. The media's preference to get a prominent story, a big headline story first. Yeah, there's no denying that the news media are sort of inherently programmed that way to get to report something major accurately and in a very, very timely fashion. And that's one of the elements, that's one of the fundamentals of American journalism. You see it in the long history of the Associated Press, the news service that goes back to the 1850s and continues to be a thriving source of news today. It's two imperatives are to be fast and accurate. You don't always get both, but that is what they seek to do. And then in this age of the digital world, everybody's becoming a wire service reporter, essentially. All journalists from major news organizations are posting to the online sites very quickly and very swiftly. And that's essentially the AP imperative, to be fast and first with the news. And so I think what we're seeing is this little understood transformation of American mainstream journalism into wire service journalism. Everybody's becoming a wire service journalist. Hope that answers your question. Yes, ma'am.
I was interested to hear what you said about journalism and heroes, because I've noticed the last several disasters that you see the CNN reporters or the ABC reporters, whatever, out there capturing themselves on tape, either using their boat to rescue someone or help lift the rubble, pass out water and stuff. And I'm just wondering what the profession, the ethics of the profession, or what ethics are taught in journalism schools that sort of allow you to get so involved or to use this tragedy for self-promotion. Is this, it seems to be the norm now, and I don't know, it seems like the news to me.
It's really a great question. The question was the ethics of injecting oneself into the coverage of a major story, such as a hurricane, in which you would be using your own boats or other equipment to help people or to call attention to the dimensions of the disaster. There was a very interesting New York Times article on this very subject in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, I believe, in which they were talking about the TV reporters who are standing out in the winds and the rain and the storms. It got to be it's such a cliche anymore that it's like almost unwatchable. My wife will watch this stuff, but I just can't put up with this anymore. This is like so routine and predictable and doesn't tell you anything. Okay, we know the winds are high and there's a lot of rain, but that's a hurricane. And it's I don't know why they do it. I don't think that it's a way to get new ratings. In fact, the ethics of it are a little bit dubious. One of the touchstones of American journalism is not to involve yourself in the news. I think that barrier, if you will, is eroding somewhat. It's not as hard and fast as it may have once been. And I think there's also an historic tendency for journalists to want to inject themselves into the news. And William Randolph Hearst did it with his New York Journal back in 1897. He came up with an approach to news called the journalism of action, saying we're not just going to report and comment on the news, we're going to step in and make a difference to the extent that we can. We're going to right the wrongs to the extent that a newspaper can. And Hearst was doing this with some forethought, I think, because he wanted to become president of the United States and use his newspapers as a stepping stone to the White House. Never happened, but nonetheless, he came up with this participatory journalism, the journalism of action, that we can see echoes of today in some of the episodes and examples that you mentioned. Journalists coming out there, rescuing people on their own and so forth. Look, a lot of news coverage is ratings driven, and this is one way to help drive the ratings is to if you have the dramatic rescue and the heroic journalist out there. Absolutely. absolutely. There was a question on this side. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm a folklorist, and folklorists are actually quite interested in fake news for a number of reasons. And the American Folklore Society meeting is in 2 weeks, and we have 4 organized panels on fake news.
Oh, fantastic. Listen, if you need a last-minute replacement, I'd be happy to step in.
I'll be in touch. So my interest here is that I find it's true with fake news that often, even though whether or not you want to include intention as part of the definition of fake news, it's often the case that someone's agenda is being served by the fake news story, whether it's the source and the reporter is just a dupe, or whether it's the reporter. I mean, and this is true both in very specific cases like Comet Ping Pong Pizza was aimed at the election, but also in general cases. I mean, I think that in the case of New Orleans, there's an agenda of sort of rock-ribbed conservatives to say if the police were unable to help you for 5 minutes, everyone would loot and you'd be murdered. And there's also an agenda of racists to say black people are always looting and raping. And you see this, all the footage of alleged rapists and looters were black, even though those people weren't really doing what was being claimed. So I think you can often find these kinds of agendas underlying the stories, even if they're not the agendas of the reporters themselves. Can you comment on that?
Sure. A comment about the agendas that may be lurking behind fake news. In the case of New Orleans post Katrina, the agenda, some of the most lurid tales about violence and mayhem and so forth were coming from the mayor and the police commissioner, the most senior authorities in the city, who journalists would be, I guess, excused for thinking that they were in positions to know what they're talking about. I mean, it's not like journalists were following up and pressing them on, okay, where did you get this information, Mr. Mayor? Because he was saying 10,000 were going to be, the death toll would be 10,000 in New Orleans, which would be just staggering. It was about a tenth or so of that. But anyway, their agenda, and the police commissioner also was putting out lurid tales about little babies being raped in the Superdome and stuff like that. His reasoning, he said later, was that he didn't want to be held, he didn't want people to think that he was covering anything up or withholding information. Therefore, he was pushing everything that he heard, including rumors and lurid tales of violence that were unconfirmed, just pushing them out into the media because he didn't want to think that people were, that he could later be accused of covering things up. Within a month or so, he had lost his job. And the mayor finally, although he was reelected, he was later indicted and convicted on corruption charges and is now a federal prisoner. Not related to Hurricane Katrina, but I think sort of speaks to the quality of public officials in New Orleans at that time. So they were pushing an agenda for sure, absolutely. And I think that there probably was an unspoken agenda that journalists were pushing too, that we can expect that this kind of thing would happen in a largely black city. There were columnists for the Washington Post who pointed that out in the immediate aftermath of the coverage of the lurid and exaggerated coverage, and I think they were right. I think they absolutely were right. One more question? Yes, sir. You were very eager. Or how much time do we have? We could. This is it? Okay. Okay. Make it a good one. A hard ball here.
If you could speak to what in the second edition of your book, the bogus quotations.
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
The fake news, because as someone with background in history, I found that particularly annoying. When I was working here on transferring transcriptions of George Washington's papers, I found that Mount Vernon is an entire website devoted to spurious Washington quotations. But you have to care to want to find them.
The question has to do with fake or spurious quotations that run rampant on the internet, that's for sure. The internet can be a good way to debunk, if belatedly, some of these lurid and exaggerated tales and bogus quotations among them. The Monticello site has also a page devoted to phony quotes attributed to Thomas Jefferson. And it is the first item that if you do a search for Jefferson quotes, that's the first return on Google, fortunately. So I guess the algorithms were working well in that case. But some of these tales are just so bizarre that almost so bizarre that maybe they are true. One of my favorite Jefferson quotes was, and you may appreciate this because of the agenda behind it, is that says that Jefferson in 1781 said, "Some of my finest hours have been spent on my back veranda, smoking hemp and watching as far as I can see." There is no evidence in his papers, his letters, his speeches, his correspondence, which was voluminous, that he ever smoked hemp. They made hemp at Monticello for clothes and for rope and things like that. It wasn't really smokable quality, I don't think. And he himself was not a smoker, Monticello says. There are no accounts of any of his many visitors to Monticello ever seeing Jefferson lighting up. They grew tobacco there, but he never smoked it, never smoked hemp. And yet this quotation, it's one of my favorites actually, appears to have been born digitally. It was made up somewhere early in the digital era and has been used as an example of, okay, if Jefferson smoked hemp, then why not legalize marijuana? In fact, Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate for president, not this most recent time, but 2012? In 2012, he was on a talk show and invoked this quotation. Didn't Jefferson say that he liked to smoke hemp? And as an example of, okay, if third president and one of the founding fathers and author of the Declaration of Independence smoked hemp, then it's good enough for us, right? So there was an agenda behind that, and it's one of these quotes that you just find on Twitter all the time. There is no attempt to knock it down or to say this is bogus, but it is quite clearly. And there are many others. I mean, great men and women are often, who are deceased, are great quotes are put into their mouths, and they never ever said these things. And Einstein, Benjamin Franklin, you name it. There's George Washington. There are lots of phony quotes attributed to these famous people of the past, and that's one way these famous quotes or these bogus quotes live on, by attachment to famous people.
Yeah, in one case with Washington, there was something from a newspaper in the 30s that quoted a legitimate thing from, I think, magazine quoted a legitimate thing from him, and then the next sentence was editorializing about gun rights. But those two sentences combined on the internet.
They get mashed together, and then lesser known people who made a comment, it sort of gets transferred to the likes of Lincoln or Jefferson or Einstein. I mean, they're out there. There are people who follow this stuff. And one of the best debunking sites that I know, and I can encourage you to check out, is called Quote Investigator, and he does a fine job of debunking bogus quotations. And he has a presence on Twitter and social media, and it's refreshing to see that kind of debunking done of bogus, spurious quotes.
We'll have to bring this discussion to an end, unfortunately, but let's thank Joe one more time.
Thank you, Georgia. Thanks, everybody. A great audience, and thank you for your fine questions.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.